Early January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, but victory was far from guaranteed. The German army had just been driven back from the Ardennes, the front lines were stabilizing, and Allied forces were preparing for the push into the heart of Germany. On the surface, the alliance looked strong. In reality, it was closer to collapse than at any point since the war began. At the center of this crisis sat Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower wasn't just commanding armies across Western Europe. He was managing egos, national pride, and the fragile political balance that held the Allied coalition together. Every decision he made carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. A misstep wouldn't just cost territory, it could tear the alliance apart. Days earlier, Britain's most famous Field Marshal, Bernard Montgomery, had stood before the press and delivered a statement that detonated like a bomb inside Allied headquarters. He claimed that during the Battle of the Bulge, it was his leadership that saved the American armies. He described U.S. forces as disorganized and implied that British command had rescued them from disaster. To American commanders and soldiers, it wasn't just an insult. It was an erasure. Newspapers across the United States erupted. Veterans who had survived the frozen forests of the Ardennes felt betrayed. Inside headquarters, anger turned into something far more dangerous: defiance. Senior American generals began telling Eisenhower they would resign rather than serve under a command structure that allowed their sacrifices to be publicly dismissed. And then came Montgomery's next move. He didn't retreat. He advanced. Montgomery demanded permanent command over two massive American formations: First Army and Ninth Army. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers. What had been a temporary emergency arrangement during the German offensive, he now wanted written into the future of Allied strategy. At that moment, the war stopped being about maps and troop movements. It became a battle over trust, ego, and authority. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. If he rejected Montgomery, he risked alienating Britain and shattering the alliance that made victory possible. If he gave in, he would lose the confidence and possibly the loyalty of his own commanders. There was no clean solution. No decision that wouldn't anger someone powerful. What followed was not a clash of armies, but a silent confrontation inside conference rooms and command tents, a crisis that threatened to fracture the Western Allies. Just months before victory, and for a brief moment in January 1945, the outcome of World War II hung not on the battlefield, but on Eisenhower's ability to hold the alliance together. On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stepped in front of the press and changed the course of the Allied command crisis. With a few carefully chosen words, the Battle of the Bulge was barely over. American units were still counting their losses. Thousands of wounded soldiers were being evacuated from frozen forests where they had fought through snow, artillery fire, and relentless German attacks. It was a moment that demanded restraint, humility, and unity. Montgomery offered none of those. Instead, he presented himself as the decisive figure who had stabilized the Northern Front. He told reporters that when he took command, American forces were disorganized and scattered. He described the battlefield on the edge of collapse, implying that American generals had panicked under pressure. Then he positioned British leadership, his leadership, as the force that restored order and stopped the German advance. The message was unmistakable. The Americans had failed. The British had saved them. Within hours, the reaction rippled across the Atlantic. American newspapers ran blistering headlines accusing Montgomery of stealing credit for victories paid for with American blood. Editorials questioned why a British commander was allowed to publicly undermine Allied unity at such a critical moment in the war. What might have been dismissed as arrogance in quieter times was now seen as a direct attack on American honor. Veterans organizations were even angrier. Survivors of the Ardennes knew the truth of that winter battle. They had held freezing foxholes with little sleep, little food, and no certainty of survival. Many had watched friends die beside them in the snow. To hear their struggle reduced to a story of confusion and rescue felt like a second assault, this time from their own side. Inside Allied headquarters, the consequences were far more dangerous. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American Army Group, was furious. He had led those forces through Normandy, across France, and into Belgium. He knew the cost of the Bulge in lives, morale, and endurance. Montgomery's remarks didn't just insult his troops, they questioned his leadership, Bradley told Eisenhower he would not tolerate it. If Montgomery was allowed to continue exercising authority over American forces while publicly disparaging them, Bradley would resign. He made it clear this was not a negotiating position. It was a line he would not cross, and Bradley was not alone. Other American commanders privately echoed his outrage. They understood what was at stake. Allowing Montgomery's claims to stand unchallenged would establish a precedent that American sacrifices could be dismissed, and American armies could be commanded and criticized by someone who took credit without sharing the cost. For Eisenhower, the press conference had transformed a manageable alliance tension into a full-scale crisis. This was no longer about wounded pride. It was about legitimacy, command authority, and the trust that held the Allied war effort together. Nearly 19,000 Americans had been killed in the Ardennes. They hadn't panicked. They had endured, and in a single press appearance, Montgomery had made it seem as if their sacrifice didn't count. That was the spark that ignited the fire, and Eisenhower now had to stop it from burning the alliance to the ground. When the German offensive exploded through the Ardennes in December 1944, Eisenhower was forced to make decisions under extreme pressure. The front lines had fractured. Communications were chaotic. American formations in the north were suddenly cut off from their normal command structure. Speed and coordination mattered more than politics. Eisenhower's solution was pragmatic. He temporarily placed two American armies, 1st Army and 9th Army, under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It was not a reward nor an endorsement of British superiority. It was a crisis measure. Montgomery's headquarters sat closer to the northern sector, and his staff was positioned to coordinate the defense more effectively while the situation stabilized. From Eisenhower's perspective, the arrangement was simple and limited. Temporary command. Emergency conditions. Once the German offensive was stopped, the armies would return to American control. Montgomery saw something very different. To him, the Battle of the Bulge was not just a German gamble, it was proof. Proof, he believed, that American forces, when placed under severe pressure, required British leadership to succeed. In his mind, the temporary transfer of command wasn't a stopgap. It was validation, and validation could be turned into authority. Montgomery began to frame the crisis not as a momentary breakdown in Allied lines, but as evidence of a structural flaw in American command. His interpretation was clear: British planning, British caution, and British leadership had restored order where American methods had failed. With that narrative in place, Montgomery made his move. He argued that returning the American armies after the Bulge would be a mistake. The war, he claimed, required concentration, not dispersion. The Allied advance had stalled because resources were spread too thin. What was needed now was a single, decisive northern thrust into Germany, one massive, carefully prepared offensive under unified command. His command, Montgomery wanted 1st Army and 9th Army, permanently assigned to his 21st Army Group. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would serve under British strategic direction for the final drive into the Reich. British and Canadian forces alone, he argued, were exhausted after 5 years of war. Without American manpower, the breakthrough he envisioned was impossible. To Eisenhower, the proposal crossed a dangerous line. The original decision had been operational, not political. It was never meant to redefine Allied command relationships. Making the arrangement permanent would strip American commanders of their forces and undermine the principle that American armies were led by American generals. But Montgomery pressed harder. He framed his demand as military logic, not ambition. The northern route, he insisted, was the fastest path to victory. Any delay in consolidating command would only prolong the war and increase casualties. Returning the armies to American control, in his view, was sentimentality, interfering with strategy. What Eisenhower had intended as a temporary necessity was now being used as leverage. The crisis measure had become a bargaining chip, Montgomery believed the success of the Bulge defense gave him the authority to reshape Allied strategy. Eisenhower understood the risk immediately. If he gave in, he wouldn't just be approving a plan, he would be surrendering control over American forces and inviting a political backlash that could tear the alliance apart. The battlefield emergency was over. The command emergency had only just begun. Omar Bradley did not hesitate. When word reached him that Bernard Montgomery wanted to keep 1st Army and 9th Army under British command permanently, Bradley's response was immediate and absolute. Those armies were not bargaining chips. They were his responsibility. He had commanded them since Normandy, led them through the hedgerows of France, across the Seine, and into the frozen chaos of the Ardennes. To Bradley, the idea of surrendering them permanently to Montgomery wasn't just insulting, it was unacceptable. Bradley made his position clear to Eisenhower. If Montgomery retained permanent command over American armies, Bradley would resign. He would not serve as an army group commander without armies to command. He would not lend legitimacy to a system that placed American soldiers under a foreign commander, who publicly questioned their competence and took credit for their sacrifice. This was not posturing. Bradley was calm, measured, and unmovable. He believed deeply in coalition warfare, but he also believed that command authority required trust. Montgomery had shattered that trust with his press conference. Without it, Bradley saw no path forward. Then George Patton entered the equation. Patton's reaction was far less restrained. His 3rd Army had slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive, pivoting 90 degrees in the middle of winter to relieve Bastogne. It was one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war, executed in brutal conditions against a desperate enemy, with speed that stunned both Allies and Germans alike. Patton had done exactly what American doctrine prized: aggressive movement, relentless pressure, and exploitation of enemy weakness, and now he was being sidelined. Patton viewed Montgomery as the embodiment of everything he despised in warfare: slow, cautious, political, obsessed with preparation and personal credit. To Patton, Montgomery didn't win wars, he managed them carefully and expensively, while others did the fighting. When Patton learned of Montgomery's demand, he told Bradley he would resign alongside him. This wasn't about rank or rivalry. For Patton, it was about honor. American soldiers had fought, bled, and died in the Ardennes. Allowing their armies to be permanently commanded by a man who dismissed their efforts was, in Patton's mind, intolerable. Eisenhower grasped the implications instantly. Montgomery was difficult, but losing him would strain relations with Britain at a critical moment. Churchill would not take it lightly. British influence over Allied strategy would suffer, but losing Bradley and Patton would be catastrophic. They weren't just generals. They were the backbone of the American command structure in Europe. If they resigned, others would follow. Army group commanders who had fought across France would refuse to serve under a command arrangement they viewed as humiliating and illegitimate. The result would be chaos. American forces would fracture at the top. The alliance would be paralyzed by internal revolt. The war effort itself could be compromised not by German resistance, but by Allied division. Eisenhower now stood at the edge of a nightmare scenario. One path risked diplomatic rupture. The other risk was the collapse of American command, and there was no way to avoid choosing between them. As the crisis deepened, it reached the highest political level of the Allied war effort. Winston Churchill could not afford to ignore it. He understood what was at stake better than anyone else in London. This was no longer a dispute between generals, it was a confrontation that threatened Britain's influence over the final phase of the war. Churchill moved quickly. He knew Montgomery was a liability, but he was also Britain's most famous field marshal. Publicly humiliating him or stripping him of American forces entirely would have consequences at home and abroad. At the same time, Churchill recognized the reality Eisenhower was facing. American generals would not accept permanent subordination, and the United States now carried the overwhelming share of the Allied war effort. Churchill's solution was a political compromise. not a military one. First Army would return immediately to American control, restoring Omar Bradley's authority and defusing the most dangerous resignation threat. Montgomery would be allowed to retain Ninth Army, but only temporarily. It was just enough American strength to preserve British relevance in the coming Rhine crossing, without surrendering overall control of American forces. To Churchill. This was damage control. To Eisenhower, it was a lifeline. Eisenhower accepted the framework, but he understood that ambiguity would only invite further conflict. Montgomery had already demonstrated a willingness to exploit temporary arrangements for permanent gain. This time, Eisenhower was determined to leave no room for interpretation. He added a critical condition: Montgomery would command Ninth Army solely for the Rhine crossing operation, not for the drive beyond it, not for operations in northern Germany. One army, one mission. When the Rhine was crossed, the army would return to American command. There would be no extensions, no renegotiation, no exceptions justified by operational necessity. This was not a suggestion. It was a boundary. When Eisenhower delivered the terms to Montgomery, the message was unmistakable. The compromise offered him a choice, not a partnership. Accept a sharply limited role or lose all. American forces immediately and permanently. Montgomery understood exactly what was happening. He argued that long-term planning required certainty of command. He warned that dividing authority after a major operation would disrupt momentum and endanger success. Beneath the professional language was a simple truth: he wanted leverage. And Eisenhower was denying it, but Montgomery had no real options. Rejecting the deal would mean commanding only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. Accepting it at least preserved the appearance of Allied unity and gave him one final opportunity to prove his vision correct. So he accepted, not because he was satisfied, not because he trusted Eisenhower, but because the alternative was political isolation and the end of his influence over Allied strategy. The compromise pleased no one. Bradley remained suspicious. Patton remained furious. Montgomery felt constrained and humiliated, but for Eisenhower, it accomplished the only goal that mattered. The alliance held just barely. By March 1945, the Rhine River stood as the last major natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. For Bernard Montgomery, it was meant to be the defining moment of his command. He prepared for the crossing with the same methodical precision that had shaped his entire career. Operation Plunder would be massive, deliberate, and overwhelming. Artillery positions were carefully plotted. Bridges were prefabricated and staged. Airborne divisions were assigned drop zones weeks in advance. Every contingency was studied, rehearsed, and refined. To Montgomery, this was how wars were won, through preparation so thorough that uncertainty was eliminated. Before the first shot was fired, then George Patton crossed the Rhine. First, on March 22, 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the river near Oppenheim and found something. Montgomery's plans had not accounted for opportunity. German defenses were thin. Resistance was disorganized. There was no reason to wait. So Patton didn't, without waiting for elaborate preparations or high-level approval. American units crossed the Rhine within hours. Engineers threw bridges across under fire. Infantry and armor poured through the gap. It was aggressive, risky, and completely in character. Patton immediately called Omar Bradley with a simple instruction: tell the world. He wanted everyone to know that the Rhine, the great obstacle Montgomery had spent months preparing to breach, had already been crossed by American forces acting on initiative and speed. It was more than a tactical success. It was a message. American mobile warfare worked. The next day, Operation Plunder went forward as planned. Montgomery's forces crossed the Rhine under massive artillery cover. Airborne troops seized ground behind German lines. Bridges rose under heavy fire. The operation succeeded, exactly as Montgomery had predicted it would. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. Montgomery's crossing was impressive, controlled, and deliberate. Patton's was fast, opportunistic, and decisive. American newspapers noticed. Military commanders noticed. Eisenhower noticed. Patton had demonstrated that the Rhine did not require weeks of preparation to breach. Speed and initiative could accomplish what elaborate planning sought to guarantee. Montgomery's carefully staged operation no longer looked like inevitability, it looked like caution. Despite this, Montgomery believed he still had leverage. After the crossing, his staff submitted plans that extended well beyond the Rhine. Those plans included Ninth Army as a permanent component of British-led operations in northern Germany. The assumption was clear: command would continue. Montgomery argued that transferring Ninth Army back to American control now would be disruptive. Operations were underway. Momentum mattered. Unity of command was essential to encircle German forces and drive northward. Removing the army, he insisted, would be militarily irresponsible. To Eisenhower, the pattern was unmistakable. Every operation justified another. Every temporary necessity became a permanent argument. The promise to return Ninth Army after the Rhine was being quietly ignored. This was exactly what Bradley and Patton had warned him about. Eisenhower had given Montgomery one final chance, one army, one mission. Montgomery had completed the mission. Now he was attempting to redefine the terms. Eisenhower decided the experiment was over. On April 4, 1945, Ninth Army officially returned to American command. The transfer was final. There would be no extensions, no compromises, no further negotiations. Montgomery would command only British and Canadian forces for the remainder of the war. Montgomery protested bitterly. He appealed to Churchill, arguing that the decision crippled his advance into northern Germany. Ninth Army, he claimed, had been essential to every operation since the Rhine crossing. Removing it now made no military sense. Churchill did not intervene. The political cost was too high. Britain's influence over Allied strategy had been declining since Normandy, and this moment made the shift unmistakable. The war would be finished under American command. Using American methods, Ninth Army continued its advance eastward under Omar Bradley. It eventually linked up with Soviet forces along the Elbe River. The army Montgomery had fought so hard to retain played its final role under American authority. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced north with British and Canadian troops, liberating the Netherlands and accepting German surrender in its sector. The war ended in victory, but not on Montgomery's terms. His vision of leading a massive Allied thrust to Berlin had died months earlier. Not in combat, but in conference rooms and press statements. In the end, Eisenhower's decision drew a clear line. Coalition warfare required trust. Montgomery had broken it. He was given one last opportunity to prove himself indispensable. Instead, he confirmed the fears of his allies. The Rhine had been crossed, but so had a boundary Montgomery would never be allowed to cross again. Montgomery's dream of leading a great Allied thrust to Berlin didn't die on the battlefield. It died in a press room. Coalition warfare runs on. Trust, and Montgomery broke it with his own ego. Eisenhower gave him one last chance. Montgomery tried to exploit it and lost everything. If you want more stories where leadership decisions shaped the outcome of history, subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments, was Eisenhower right, or should military logic have outweighed alliance politics? The next crisis is already waiting.